Good morning. This is Mr. Spencer, and today we're working on simulation scenarios, and this is the oil well scenario. So, suppose the probability that an exploratory well will strike oil is about zero point 0.2, in other words, 20% of the time. Conduct a simulation to answer the following questions. Assume that the outcome, oil or no oil, for any one explanatory well is independent. In other words, one doesn't depend on the other from the other wells. Use the random number table below and conduct 20 trials. Clearly identify each trial on the table. Estimate the average number of wells that need to be drilled in order to strike oil. So the very first thing I need to do is I need to determine which numbers I want to use to represent an oil strike and which ones do I want to represent those that don't strike oil. I'm going to choose 0 and 1 because that's two numbers or 20%. So I would work left to right choosing single digit numbers because single digit numbers are going to be faster than two digit numbers. I could use two digit numbers, but a single digits will be much faster. So I'm going to choose 0 and 1. So if I do that, 0 and 1 represent the oil strikes, and the other numbers, which is 2 through 9, represent wells that did not strike oil. There are no skips, and repeats are allowed. Now, before I can get to this next part, which I know you can read the answer, I need to go ahead and run the simulation. So when I run the simulation, I'm looking for numbers that are 0 and 1. So the very first time, and I'm going to go start with a blank sheet of paper here, and I'll come back to that. So 471, oh, there's my first oil strike right there. How many wells? 3. Then I go along and I don't get my next oil strike until I get that 0. Now I have 1, 2, 3, 4. So basically, I'm looking for numbers that are either a 0 or a 1. Well, here, that's 2. Hey, we got a 0 on the first well. We got another 0 on the first well. And then we go, no 0, 1, no 0, 1, no 0, 1, no 0, 1. So we had to go all the way out to here. And if I count up all those wells, it's a whole lot. I believe I had to go 5, 10, 15, 19 wells. All right, going on the next line, 3, 6, 6, 5, 3, nothing. Then I get a hit here. All right, so this is going to be 10 wells. Here is 2. I don't get another one until I get to here, which is 7. Then we get one right at 5. Then we have one at 2. Now this next one is the last one I'm going to do, but it's kind of important because I'm going to go ahead and wrap around. So nothing, nothing, nothing. And then I wrap around, and that's when I get my next oil well. And so this is the 9th because we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 where we didn't hit oil, and the 9th one where we did. So I went ahead and ran the entire simulation. Okay, and so that's my mark. So you might want to pause the video there so you can check your work and catch up. And then I made a nice table of it. All right, so there's a listing of the times, and we know that the first time it took 3, etc. So I made my list of the table, and here's my table so that you can add all those up. And when I did add all those up, I found that I struck oil. I found that I had to drill 98 times. So this totaled up to 98. I took 98, I divided it by 20. And that told me that on average, I needed to drill 4.9 wells. And up at the top of the page, we go ahead and say, based on the simulation below, well, first of all, 20 trials were run and 98 wells were drilled. That was my total. Based on the simulation below, we would expect to have to drill an average of 4.9 wells in order to strike oil. Sometimes we drilled only one well and were successful. And I think we had the most we had to drill was 19. So it kind of just depended on how it went. All right. So basically, but on average, it's 4.9 wells. So the next part, it says, what is the probability that it'll take fewer than 3 attempts to strike oil? Well, I could go back and look through my simulation, but that's a little bit of a pain. It's much easier to look at my table, but I want fewer than 3. That means it needs to be either 1 attempt or 2 attempts. So looking at my table, here's a 2, here's a 1, here's a 1, here's a 2, here's a 2, here's a 2, here's a 2, and there's a 2. And when I added all those up, I find that it happens 8 out of 20 times. Just pause record. So as I was saying, it took 8 out of 20 times, or basically we were successful. It took 48% of the time oil was struck in less than 3 times. In other words, it's either struck on the first or the second well. And once again, it's a lot easier to go through the table and count those up. All right, because all I did was sit there and go any time that I had a 2 or 1. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It happened 8 times out of 20. The next thing is part C. What is the probability that it'll take exactly 6 wells? So once again, I could go through the simulation and look that up, but it's a lot easier to go back and use my table. So I'm looking at the table and I'm looking for 6. And I'm not seeing it in the first column, so it hasn't happened yet. And then here I find we have 1 that happened on 6, and then the very last one happened to be out of 6. So it happened 2 times out of 20, which is 10% of the time. So the probability of striking oil on exactly the 6th time happened 2 out of 20 times, or 10% of the time. So about 10% of the time we expect to strike oil on the 6th one. And that is a simulation. Make sure that when you run the simulation, you always assign your digits. You always address whether or not repeats are allowed or not. Make a table, and then always make a conclusion. All right, the conclusion should always look like, based on the simulation above or below, depending on how you set it up, we expect to have to drill an average of what, or we have to do something an average number of times in order to be successful. The last thing I want to say is make a table. Mark these neatly and make a table. We will be looking for our grading purposes on the quiz for a table, so go ahead and make sure you do that. And thank you very much, and we'll be quizzing on this on Monday.